Well, thanks a lot for everyone for having me here to speak today. As Ashok mentioned, I have pretty extensive experience in FDA regulatory issues, in particular in FDA's regulation of medical software. What we'll cover in this presentation today is mobile medical apps. There's a guidance that was issued not more than, I believe, 2 months ago that finalized some guidance that FDA indicated would be applicable to what are called mobile medical apps, and will provide what FDA's definition is for that term, and also talk about generally what makes medical software a medical device, quote unquote, that is regulated by FDA. And I'll talk a little bit about what the implications of that are. We're going to talk initially about what is the definition of a medical device, because that is essentially how FDA determines whether or not it has regulatory authority over a software product. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the special categories that have been set up that apply to freestanding medical software that's regulated by FDA, and in particular the category of mobile medical applications. And then we'll talk a bit about what some of the responsibilities are that apply to mobile medical app manufacturers and then mobile medical app distributors. So, first of all, this comes from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and this is FDA's definition for what constitutes a medical device. And it's, an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, or other similar or related article, including any component, part, or accessory, which is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions. And just a point of note, when we talk about conditions, this language was introduced because FDA wanted to have the regulatory authority over pregnancy test kits, and so pregnancy is not going to be classified as a disease, so they termed it other conditions. And then in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of the disease, and to affect the structure or function of the body. So if it meets one of those categories, then it becomes a medical device. What does that mean? And I'll skip ahead a bit. So if something is regulated as a medical device, that means that FDA has the authority to require manufacturers to register and list. Registration is essentially telling FDA where you are, where you're located. Listing is telling FDA what specific products you're making. Pre-market submissions, unless they're exempt, and that's generally those are 2 types of 510K or a PMA. I won't get into what that actually means, but there are pre-market submissions. They have different levels of how much detail you can provide. Design controls, I think I mentioned this briefly in the prelude to starting in on this. Medical devices are very highly technical products that need to protect human life or to prevent disease. And FDA, in its review, found that most of the reasons why medical devices were being recalled, this is back in the late 80s, early 90s, was because there was a flaw in how they were designed. So what FDA did was impose specific requirements on the development process for a new medical device. And so you have to follow that design process and comply with the regulations in order to produce it. So that's one of the requirements. And then there were other quality manufacturing practice requirements that you need to comply with. Those are set out in the quality system regulation. You need to report adverse events once you start marketing your product. You need to report when you conduct a recall. And this could also apply to when you update software. I know a lot of people will push out updates through the internet. That could actually constitute a recall if it's regulated by FDA. And if it is a recall that affects the health or safety of the product, then you would need to report that to FDA. And then there are some other requirements. So one of the things about the software, the mobile medical app guidance that was put out, was it provides an awful lot of guidance that was provided originally back, I think about 15 years ago, and then FDA quietly withdrew the guidance that set out the policy on what medical software is a medical device and regulated by FDA, and what medical software isn't a medical device. So a lot of these categories that are covered here are put out in the, are found in the guidance, but they're, the guidance is actually reiterating a lot of the policies that have been followed by FDA for a number of years. So this isn't actually new, but it is something that you should think about. So one of the categories that is exempt, it's medical software, but it's not a medical device, are electronic copies of medical textbooks, teaching aids, or reference materials, even if they're web searchable. And then another big category, especially applicable to mobile medical apps, is software that's used solely to log, record, track, evaluate, or make decisions or suggestions as to general health and wellness. So this would be logs that track your diet, making suggestions of what food choices you make based on like calorie counts, making suggestions on proper posture, or making suggestions on exercise. Those are exempt under the guidance. Other categories, a lot of medical software covers billing operations, coding, reimbursement. That software is not FDA regulated. And also any software that has the functionality of an electronic health record or a personal health record, that's also exempt, except for situations where that software interacts with a medical device. Then that potentially brings that software within the regulation of a medical device. Training, if software provides training, software that serves as a generic aid, but is not marketed for a specific medical indication. For example, if you take advantage of the flashlight on your iPhone, but you use it in a medical capability, that is not regulated as a medical device. Now, if some app manufacturer has some idea of fine-tuning that flashlight capability and then provides a specific medical purpose for that flashlight, then that becomes a regulated medical device. Some other exemptions are software that allows users to input patient-specific information along with reference material to automatically diagnose the disease. I mean, that is a device, but as we said, there may be some functionality that's either being put in, capabilities that are present in electronic health record systems that may not be actively regulated by FDA. Although the more specific you make those indications, I would suggest the more likely they are to be FDA regulated. And then generic aids promoted for medical applications. As I said, the flashlight that's specifically intended for a medical So there are some general categories for medical device software. These are software categories that FDA has already recognized and then regulates. You have medical device data systems, mobile medical apps, which we'll talk about in a bit, laboratory information systems, picture archiving and communication systems, and remote patient monitoring systems. One category in particular I'll point out is the medical device data systems. That's when you integrate the electronic medical device that has some diagnostic function or maybe has some treatment function, and then you have software drawing information from that medical device, either to store it for its own purposes or porting it to an electronic health record or otherwise. Basically, once you start taking electronic data from a device without controlling the medical device, then you fall within FDA's regulatory category of an MDDS. That's a Class 1 device. It is 510K exempt, meaning you don't need to have a pre-market submission for it. But you can't do anything with that data other than transfer, store, convert, or display it. Once you start adding alarms, bells, whistles, things like that, that's when you start entering into a higher risk category. So, as I say, the MDDS at one point it's not intended for active patient monitoring. So once you start actively monitoring patients, then you start going into a higher category of risk, which requires pre-market submission of some sort. So mobile medical apps, this is the category that's covered by the guidance. Those are software applications that are executed on mobile platforms. They're supposed to be used on what are called mobile platforms. So FDA changed the definition from the draft guidance to the current guidance, where they changed it in such a way that it pretty much expanded it to pretty much swallow up the whole rule, I would think. Now it's commercial off-the-shelf computing platforms with or without wireless connectivity that are handheld in nature. Before, it was much more specifically limited to tablets and handheld devices, but computers that are, I guess, handheld in nature, one could argue whether or not this is, successfully argued, but I mean, this is a MacBook Air. It has pretty much the capabilities of a fully functioning computer. And I can use this holding it in my hand. So, with this type of computing power that you can hold in your hand, it pretty much removes this category of mobile medical apps, I would think, and pretty much creates an entire category now of any medical software, just because now it can be loaded onto any platform. So mobile medical apps need to fit into a certain type of category in order to fall within this definition. Although, for me, looking at the categories, I can't think of a category that doesn't qualify as a medical device that also doesn't automatically fall within one of these categories. So, you have the MDDS type, where it's displaying, storing, analyzing, or transmitting patient-specific data. You've got accessories, which are controlling a connected medical device. You've got mobile medical apps that transform the device in some way into a medical device, either by doing some functionality, whether it's taking the camera and using it to record and view skin lesions, let's say, or taking it and using its computing power to render some sort of diagnostic help to the physician, and that's the patient-specific analysis. So if it fits within one of these categories and it goes on a handheld platform, then it's a mobile medical app. Now, technically, FDA is going to exercise enforcement discretion for mobile medical apps that, for mobile apps that are medical software that are not a mobile medical app, despite meeting the definition of a device. Not sure what those would be, but FDA will also exercise enforcement discretion for mobile medical apps that will help patients self-manage their disease, provide patients with simple tools to organize and track health information, provide easy access to information related to patient health, conditions, or treatments, help patients document, show, or communicate potential medical conditions, automate simple tasks for healthcare providers, and enable patients or providers to interact with personal health records or electronic health record systems. So, enforcement discretion, one of the categories, as I said, is to these simple medical calculations. And they give some examples in the guidance, including calculation of body mass index, total body water, mean arterial pressure, Glasgow coma scale scores. Just to give you some perspective, I mean, I've dealt with medical devices that had embedded software that did medical calculations that involved an awful lot of review by FDA. So this sort of exemption is, I find, kind of interesting. We actually dealt with a situation where it was a calculation taught in the medical school, was routinely used in clinical practice, yet we had to establish to FDA the clinical significance of that calculation because it was only used in certain situations. And a side note, the specific calculation we were dealing with had terminology that suggested a clinical application that was outside of what it was actually being used for. So, but this is a pretty large exemption that's applicable to mobile medical apps.
I'm not sure I understood the implication. Are you saying that if you have a body mass index calculator, you have to go to the FDA and say, is this regulated or not?
No.
Is that what you're saying?
If it's a mobile medical app and it's a body mass index calculator, you do not. It's exempt. If it's not on a mobile platform, then you may.
I'm just wondering, you know, decision support software, which category would that fall in?
Decision support
Right,
software.
diagnosis decision, treatment decisions, where you put in, it is patient-specific information.
Right, and
But
it's rendering some
I'm sort of
type
confused as to which, it seems like it's between two of them, but, well, go ahead.
Yeah, the performing patient-specific analysis and diagnosis, that would be regulated.
So that's where it would be.
Yeah, it can fall within a mobile medical app if you put it on a mobile phone, but it's also regulated as a medical device. And that's irrespective of, so this enforcement discretion doesn't really include that. It only really covers these simple calculations.
That's, I was thinking, okay.
Yeah, so no, if you take body mass index and then, you take some other information from the patient and then diagnose cancer using that, that's beyond the simple calculation.
You answered my question. Thanks.
Forgive me if you get into this, but when you build a mobile medical app, there are functions that go around to complete this solution.
Yes.
Like validating patients or users. Are those included considered part of the mobile medical app, or can you quarantine those?
Like you're talking about like the web-based applications. So
well, if I bring a device into just a clinician's environment, I want to authenticate that the users are going to use this device. Or perhaps go communicate with an LDAP server. Is that function, and this device is this solution falls within the regular, class 2 device. Is that user authentication component considered a part of the 510K submission?
Yes.
Or can I?
No, you would cover it all. Generally, when you're dealing with the actual application, the submission to FDA, you talk about all the functionality that's covered. FDA is going to focus in only on the functionality that has patient efficacy or safety implication. Also, there's cybersecurity. That there's a draft guidance out currently where FDA is starting to talk about requirements on cybersecurity. But so, other than those 3 categories, you would talk about it. You describe it. You probably provide some information about it in some of the design documents that you submit to FDA. But FDA is really only going to be focused on the functionality that provides the safety and efficacy of the medical product.
Clarification, please. You're saying that the FDA regulates this stuff, and then you say draft guidance. It's my understanding that Congress required FDA, FCC, and OMC to get expert advice, for example, FIDASIA, and basically they have a year to then come up with formal policies. So there's no formally accepted, legally codified policy right now with the FDA regarding this stuff.
Regarding what?
Regarding the things you're talking about.
No, mobile medical app guidance has been,
Formally?
is no longer a draft, is an actual guidance. So the rules, you can rely on the contents of the draft guidance in making your determination. And essentially, the mobile medical app guidance lays out the categories that FDA has always considered not to be a medical device, that are software specific. So that's not really, too much controversy in that. The mobile medical app portion of the guidance, there are some categories that FDA says they're exercising enforcement discretion. And those, such as this simple medical calculations piece, those, since it's enforcement discretion, there's no affirmative requirement on manufacturers to submit anything to FDA or to comply with FDA requirements under that category. And then there's really no actual additional requirements that FDA is imposing on manufacturers under the mobile medical app guidance as it's currently drafted. So it really just sort of helps to lay out what are the divisions between what's a medical device and what isn't. And then within that category of mobile medical apps, what is FDA going to exercise enforcement discretion on and what is FDA not going to exercise enforcement discretion on. And then on top of that, the draft did lay out some specific requirements, well, not really specific requirements, made some suggested requirements on what are called mobile medical app distributors. Those were all taken out of the draft in the current guidance. So there was a requirement, there was language in the original draft that said, iTunes, we want you to make sure that you cooperate with mobile medical app manufacturers in conducting recalls and reporting adverse events. That language came out of the final guidance. So there's no affirmative requirements in this guidance. There's nothing new that FDA is putting in now.
So it's classificatory rather than...
Yeah, there's nothing that nothing new that FDA is requiring companies to do, is how I read it, so. So, just quickly cover some of these other categories that you might run into. If the software handles in vitro diagnostic data related to patient specimen identification, tests requested, results reported, quality control testing, sample analysis generally, that's called the Laboratory Information System. It's Class 1, 510K exempt, much like the much like the MDDS category. There's the Picture Archiving and Communication System, the PACS. That's software that's capable of accepting, transferring, displaying, and storing digitally processed images. So whereas the MDDS is for numbers, PACS are for pictures. So because we're dealing with radiology images, it's a higher level of risk in FDA's mind, so that's a Class 2, it requires a 510K. And then remote patient monitoring systems, this is a category I've dealt with on a number of occasions. This is software that provides monitoring of physiological data to provide signals and alarms for patient monitoring. So FDA, another piece in here is FDA helpfully provided some information on what constitutes a mobile medical app manufacturer versus the other types of entities that are involved in the development of software. Basically, the key here is you have to be the owner of that. You're either initiating the specifications, the requirements, even though other parties might be doing the coding for you. If your name goes on that software at the end of the day, and you tell your software development house that you want to draft a software that'll monitor blood pressure and glucose and temperature on a routine basis, and then you say, okay, go ahead, do the coding, and then send me the code back. And they do that, and you test it, or you have them test it, but you're marketing it, you're the manufacturer. So that was something that FDA laid out. One of the categories, too, that FDA excluded from this category is licensed practitioners who manufacture or alter a mobile medical app solely for use in their professional practice or group, and do not label or promote their mobile medical apps to be generally used by other licensed practitioners or other individuals outside their group. And this might in some way be directed at some of the issues you were raising about the EHR systems and what EHR systems can and can't do. Because of that, individualization of software in order to create rules in which you can identify patient risks and things like that. FDA is sort of tacitly acknowledging that that is going on to a certain extent. And then anything that is in the research phase or anything that's being used as part of medical research, that's exempt, although the products themselves may be subject to investigational device exemption requirements. So as I mentioned before, there was this category of what are called mobile medical app distributors. This was in the draft guidance where FDA identified operators of these app distributors, Google Play, iTunes, BlackBerry App World, and classified them as mobile medical app distributors, and said that they're essentially suggested that they cooperate with manufacturers in conducting corrections and removal actions, but then eliminated this category in the actual official guidance that was issued 2 months ago. So it's not clear what responsibilities iTunes or Apple or BlackBerry have over these apps now, but I would think that if there is an issue where there's some risk or some recall problem that gets raised. This is a concern that mobile medical app manufacturers need to consider.